Hello and a very warm welcome to you all for Professor of Environmental Governance Peter Jones' retirement lecture entitled Governing Marine Protected Area, MPA's Resilience Through Diversity. To all who don't know me, my name is Jan Axmacher. I'm here, I guess, as the Deputy Head of Department. And yeah, it's a great honor to host this event today, but it's obviously also quite sad in a way to officially say goodbye to Peter Jones. Although I hope he's not leaving kind of for good, so but of course it kind of still marks an end of an era in a way. Yeah, think of Peter, first of all, I think we all, or at least many of us, will agree that he really crucially influenced our thinking on how we manage and govern protected areas in general. So he's really influenced my thinking, at least, very strongly, and I think also a whole generation of conservationists who came through the MSc conservation program, not least. Peter Jones also played a very crucial and fundamental role, I think, in securing the future of the MSc conservation at a time when things were a bit rougher. And yeah, I'm very, very grateful for that, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. Because him keeping the MSc going kind of then secured my position, and the rest is history. So I'm very, very grateful for that. Also, Peter Jones, looking at his career a bit, has obviously supervised a lot of students, not only on the MSc conservation, but also PhD students, who in many cases then continued and followed their own academic careers, or went into quite kind of influential organizations, like the International Seabed Authority, for instance, where they now really also have a very strong impact on how we protect the marine environment. So there's quite a lot of impact there as well. Yeah, basically also looking at Peter's kind of publication records, quite impressive as well. I had a look an hour ago, and on Google Scholar there are currently 199 references, or items listed. And yeah, I'm sure we all are looking forward to, or many of us at least, to seeing the 200 plus kind of occurring there, briefly to see how Peter's thinking develops in relation to the kind of governance of marine protected areas and the management of the natural environment in general. So yeah, obviously they have been cited more than 5,500 times as well for the people who are interested in numbers, like myself. Probably nobody else is, but anyway, just putting that out there. So quite an impressive record overall. Nonetheless, Peter is also a colleague who doesn't only talk about impact, but who really ensures that the quite important and kind of crucial findings his research yield really make it into kind of government policy. So he has played a crucial role in advising a whole range of organizations. And yeah, sorry for the acronym bingo I'm playing now. But some of these include, for instance, the UNDP, IUCN, OECD, CBD, which other ones can I mention here, EU, DG Fisheries, DEFRA, and also he advised the government, both House of Commons, I guess, and House of Lords in committees there. So really a researcher with a very, very rounded profile, whose research isn't only pushing kind of the knowledge boundaries of how we look at the governing of marine protected areas, but really has a real-life impact. Nonetheless, you're not here to listen to me, but to Peter. So with that, I'll just hand over to Peter Jones. And yeah, many thanks for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Warning, old guy doing a selfie alert. Old guy doing a selfie alert. Oh. Give me a big wave, people. It's over, don't worry. Right, now we've got that nonsense out of the way. I'm delighted to see so many of you here tonight. When I initially agreed to give this talk, it seemed like a really good idea. A week ago, it seemed like a less good idea. But right now, it seems like a completely splendid idea. Because it's been such a good turnout. Thank you very much. So, without any further ado, I shall dive straight into the autobiographical part of the talk, and then we'll take a deep dive into governance theory, very briefly, a shallow dip perhaps, and then I'll give you an overview of some forthcoming publication where we've analysed 50 marine protected area case studies. It is forthcoming, and I'm sure none of you will be even slightly tempted to do it, but please no tweeting or social mediaing of the content. So the title of this talk is Governing Marine Protected Areas, Resilience through Diversity. What's this all about? Well, we can kind of think about another question. How can we influence the behaviour of people who use marine ecosystems in ways that fulfil both resource use and marine conservation priorities? I think that's a question which is at the heart of this research. Another way of putting it is it's all about people. All my research is about people, and I do research on marine ecosystems, but I mainly spend all my time talking to people about marine ecosystems, how they use them, how they value them. I originally trained in biological sciences, but I've kind of unwittingly metamorphosed into a human geographer, I'm delighted to say. It's all about people, and I particularly want to thank three people here. Rick Stafford. Isn't it great when your pointer's completely wiped out by the screen? Rick Stafford, Isabel Hess, and Thoy Zong Chu, who are my collaborators in this analysis of the 50 case studies. But let's go back. Let's go back to me being born in Liverpool in 1962, Wigan in 1962, to my wonderful parents, John Jones and Patricia. My father was a policeman. So was my mother. They met at Police Training College. I was born in Wigan. We eventually moved to Liverpool, and then I'm delighted to say that when I was 4 years old, we moved to Poole in Dorset, where we spent a lot of time on the beach. And I think it was those many, many, many days, delightful days on the beach, that really kindled my interest in oceans, seas, and marine conservation. I can remember as a child with lollipop sticks. I like lollipops, but what I really liked about lollipop sticks was they were good for poking butterfish out of the groins. And I was kind of already beginning to try and work out zonation when I was about 11 years old. So I think marine ecology was always something that I was going to get into. Fast forward to 1985. Fast forward to 1985. I had a lot of distractions as an undergraduate. But I did also occasionally study in biological sciences. I specialised in marine biology. Moving quickly on, I started an MSc in Marine Resource Development and Protection at the Institute of Offshore Engineering at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh in 1987. This was one of the first applied interdisciplinary marine courses. It was a combination of marine ecology and marine policy. And this wonderful chap here, Martin Wilkinson, being a really key inspiration for my career, a very eminent phycologist who's into seaweeds. But I still hear myself when I'm lecturing emulating Martin's up and down style. After I finished the MSc in 1988, I worked at the Institute of Offshore Engineering for a few months, initially organising a conference on the management of the North Sea. So this was kind of like the beginning of my metamorphosis into someone that was as interested in marine policy and law as I am in marine ecosystems and the people that use them. And I remain fascinated by policy and law to this day. I then worked as a consultant to the Crown Estate on the west coast of Scotland for a while. Wonderful year. It wasn't so good working for the Crown Estate, but it was a good year because I got to drive all over the west coast of Scotland, visiting salmon farms, visiting various tenants of the marine of the Crown Estate, and that was a really enjoyable time. But I yearned to be back at university again, so I returned to the Institute of Offshore Engineering at Heriot-Watt University in 1991 to work as a research associate full-time, whilst also registered for a part-time PhD. And for the first 3 years there, I spent an awful lot of time offshore, leading environmental monitoring surveys around North Sea oil platforms. The oil platforms were there. Now we know that the oil platforms were obviously contributing to the major problem that we're all facing now, But at that time, we were more focused on what we call the upstream impacts. What are the environmental consequences of the installations themselves? It was also a very good way of paying off the debt that I built up when I was self-funding on my MSc. Then in 1994, when I met Jo, who's here tonight, when she was taking the same MSc as I had previously studied for. We collaborated on our dissertation studies on the environmental valuation of the Firth of Forth, doing a lot of interviews in a place called Valleyfield, which one of the locals has imaginatively retitled. And we've been together ever since, and I'm delighted to have our two children here with us this evening. Whilst I was studying for my PhD, I led a successful application for EC funding for a collaborative research project on the role of value conflict assessment techniques in coastal zone management. This was quite a big break. It was a big grant. It guaranteed my funding for the completion of my PhD. And it also was the beginning of my delving into collaborative research with European partners. And I should particularly point out my PhD supervisor, John Scythe, here, who we saw in Orkney last summer for the first time in 20 years. And also this chap, Clemens Davos, who's an economist, but very quantitative approach. But he was very instrumental in us gaining this grant because the Commission were intrigued by his quantitative approach to assessing values in coastal zone management. I went around administering his questionnaires, which were very data-driven, and I had lots of conversations with people whilst they were filling in the questionnaires. And I came away thinking, I learned more from those conversations than I learned from the analysis of the data. And I think that was my coincidental discovery of what I now call conversations with a research purpose. And we've also had partners here from Greece, Belgium, and Spain. So I got my PhD finally in 1997, long hard slog, 6.5 years as a part-time PhD student whilst working full-time for the Institute. An analysis of value conflicts underlying the objectives, selection and management of marine protected areas. Pictured here with our family, including my sister, who I'm delighted is here this evening, with her daughter Esme, who is pictured here. Some time ago, Esme. Some time ago. And my parents again, and Jo. Shortly after I finished my PhD, I started at UCL in July 1997. And it was interesting because I remember walking around UCL in the autumn of 1997, and this little voice in my head said, "You're going to retire from here." And here I am. So it wasn't like all the other voices, it was actually speaking some sense. I joined the Jackson Environment Institute, led by the wonderful John Merlis, here on the right, working as a research fellow on integrated coastal zone management, where I met Jackie Burgess, who helped deepen my understanding of and experience of ethnographic research. She was a human geographer in the department, became my unofficial mentor, and I collaborated with her on some research on marine protected area governance, funnily enough, in the UK. And she really brought me up to speed, trained me, got me fully immersed in ethnographic research and exploring various theoretical concepts. And perfected, or at least helped develop my skills in these conversations with a research purpose. Talking to people, learning how they value marine ecosystems, how they use them. I should also mention Peter Wood, who I'm delighted is also here this evening, and Richard Munton here, who played key roles in facilitating my transition to appointment as a lecturer in the Department of Geography in 2001, particularly to take on the running of the MSc Conservation that Jan's already mentioned. The MSc Conservation itself being the first applied interdisciplinary masters in the UK, and those are words which keep on coming up on the research. It's about applied interdisciplinary approaches. But the MSc Conservation is even older than me. It goes back. It started in 1961, and it's still running now. In 1998, our daughter Kirsty was born, and in 2000, our son Nathan. Raising them with Joe has undoubtedly been the most rewarding and valued experience in my life, which is why I'm so delighted that they're here this evening. Often involving us all, in the words of my daughter, gravitating towards the coast. I'm sure my children will fondly remember many spring breaks in the Mediterranean, and they could recite the 5 reasons why the Mediterranean is relatively unproductive. And no, don't ask me to cite them now, but we might put them on the spot later on. So I remember the children saying, we're not sure if this is a holiday, a field trip, or a military operation, but some of it appears to have rubbed off on them at least. Coincidentally, we had a very memorable day on this ship here in the middle. I won't go into the details, kids, but suffice to say it put them off going to sea for life, I think. But some of you that have been around as long as I have might recognise this person here, Ita MacDonald, who was a secretary in the department, and she'd retired by this time, but her and her partner were going around the UK in this cabin cruiser, and Ita being Ita, emailed me and said, do you want to come out on a little trip on the boat? A very memorable trip, as it turned out. It was rough. It was very rough. So that's kind of like the autobiographical part. That's the fun bit. Incidentally, I'm now the chair of the Sussex Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority, and if one of my officers was here, they'd be frowning at me saying, those are below the minimum landing size, Pete. But the regulations don't strictly apply to anglers yet. So, let's take the shallow, short dive into some of the governance theories that I've been wrestling with. So meanwhile, back at UCL, my research evolved. To take it back to first principles, which is what I always like to do, there are 3 sources of governance steer I recognise, noting that the verb to govern is derived from the Greek verb to steer. So the simplest definition of what does to govern mean, it means to steer. And there are 3 approaches that are commonly recognised. Top-down, state control and regulations. Bottom-up, participation and the empowerment of people. And markets, economic instruments, assignation of property rights. Plato, but way back in 360 BC, coining this verb to govern in this respect. There is a current focus in contemporary governance debates and initiatives on market and participative approaches. That's cutting a very long story very short. But there is a resurgent interest in the role of the state, which is evolving as society itself evolves. And I've always remained interested in the role of the state working alongside the role of people and the role of markets, always looking at reality and seeing the state everywhere. Going back to the governance books and seeing the state being kind of airbrushed out and very much a focus on people and market approaches. But I remain interested in the role of the state in coordinating, becoming more about decentralisation, though, rather than command and control. Though this reconfigured role of the state still remains important, especially in the face of challenges such as climate change and biodiversity. But there is growing recognition in governance debates more broadly that there's a need to move beyond ideological arguments as to which of these governance approaches is best or which one is right, and to develop governance models, frameworks and approaches that combine the role of states, markets and people, which is a theme that consistently runs through my research. So to cut a long story short, I say that quite a lot in lectures apparently, the students tell me, I explored various theoretical approaches over the course of 15 years, particularly participatory development and common pool resource governance theories. But the theories, assumptions and concepts underlying this research just did not map onto the realities of the case studies that I was looking at. I was always very case study driven. First and foremost, looking at the realities of case studies and seeing if the theories and the concepts matched up to the realities. Inspired by the work of Jackie Burgess, Eleanor Ostrom, and particularly Richard Norgard, I adopted the concept of co-evolutionary development, premised on the argument that we need to move beyond the top-down monocentric governance or bottom-up polycentric governance dichotomy. It isn't an either-or. To recognise the role of the state in co-evolutionary governance. So the co-evolutionary governance concept that I've used in my research for the last 15 years, and that is at the core of this talk this evening, this is what I call, can be termed, an applied realist institutional analysis approach, based on the grounded theory of co-evolutionary governance. It's grounded because this theory, or my understanding of this theory, has itself emerged through case studies. This concept and this focus on co-evolution was also inspired by my long-standing fascination with ecological co-evolution, first described by Charles Darwin in 1859, discussing how the evolution of plants and their pollinating insects could not be understood by looking at the fossil record just of the flowers or just of the insects. You had to look at how they functionally interacted, how they co-evolved. The term wasn't itself coined until the 1960s, but now we've developed the term to apply to this theory of governance. So here we're looking at MPAs. Don't worry, this is the last of the conceptual theoretical diagrams that are completely abstract. Anyway, we're looking at a marine protected area here as a cross-sectoral governance initiative, hence the need for cross-sectoral integration. Marine protected areas are often designated by a conservation ministry, but many other sectoral functions along the bottom here are relevant to marine protected areas, hence the need for cross-sectoral integration, which I've characterised here as the need for horizontal co-evolution. MPAs are also embedded in both higher level and local institutions, hence the need for the integration of top-down and bottom-up approaches, represented here as vertical co-evolution. So co-evolutionary governance addresses the dilemma of whether institutions should be built from the top down or the bottom up. Instead, institutions co-evolve through a functionally integrated combination of top-down and bottom-up approaches, along with the pervasive influence of markets. And this is what we term decentralisation in the shadow of hierarchy. And if you want to explore that concept further, I refer you to this paper which I produced with Steve Long, who I'm delighted to say is also here this evening. Nice to see you, Steve. So that's a very brief, shallow dive into the theory behind all this. Let's get back to policy land. I'm much more comfortable in policy land, I must admit. And we're looking particularly now at the marine protected area policy target context for this research, the so-called 30 by 30 target, which was recently agreed. That by 2030, at least 30% of marine and coastal areas are effectively conserved through equitably governed systems of protected areas and other area-based conservation measures, recognising indigenous and traditional territories and sustainable uses of those territories. So this is the latest target. Before it was 10% by 2020. We didn't achieve that, so we decided to up our ambitions to 30% by 2030. Not an uncontroversial target. Many people fear that this could turn into a green land grab. That would be another lecture on its own right. But nonetheless, this is the policy backdrop, the target that countries around the world are currently striving towards, including the UK. Where are we up to? Well, the UN World Database on Protected Areas estimates that currently 8.2% of the global ocean area is protected by around 18,720 marine protected areas. So I've got plenty of marine protected areas still to do research on. But more detailed and incisive analyses by the Marine Conservation Institute estimate that only 2.9% of the global ocean area is effectively protected by around 1,042 marine protected areas, out of a total of over 16,600 marine protected areas. So the world is littered with paper marine protected areas, marine protected areas that have been designated, but actually so far are not proving to be effective for a variety of reasons. Also, coverage of these marine protected areas within marine ecoregions of the world, wonderful acronym MEOW, is also uneven and variable. So if we're going to achieve the network objectives of representativity and connectivity, which are also elements of that target, there's still a great deal of work to do. So many more effective MPAs will be needed to achieve the target, and these MPAs must also be equitable, which is kind of like the policy driver behind all my research. How can we make marine protected areas effective and equitable? It's widely recognised that the design and management of MPAs must be both top-down and bottom-up. That's standard guidance in marine protected area governance now, usually through some form of co-management. But what does co-management actually mean? What does combining top-down and bottom-up approaches actually mean in practice? That's very much the focus of our research. So more questions. How should we go about steering human uses of marine protected areas to make them more effective and equitable? We don't govern, steer marine ecosystems. They're very good at it. We do impact them, but the governance is all focused on changing the behaviour of people. A related question is, how can we build resilience to climate change and other potentially perturbing environmental and human influences? These are the key questions that the MPA governance project aims to address now through 50 case studies in 24 countries in this forthcoming paper. Here are the 50 case studies in 24 countries. The key here is their level of effectiveness, but more of that later on. But again, to emphasise that this is an empirical case study-based approach. The concept of MPAs as co-evolutionary social ecological systems itself emerged from the findings of this research. So this is very much an empirical approach. You can take the biologist out of the biology lab, but I don't think you can take the biologist out of the researcher. It's not a random sample. This is more opportunistic than random. But certainly the case studies weren't selected to prove any particular hypothesis. And I'm delighted to say that over the last 15 years, 70 researchers have contributed to these case studies and various publications arising from them. This is master students from UCL, PhD students from UCL and other universities, other academic researchers from various universities around the world, and also, very importantly, marine protected area practitioners. So this has been a very sort of applied approach to analysing these 50 case studies. I used to apologise for only having 50 case studies now, and my target was to try and have 200. Now I've actually realised that 50 is quite enough in itself, because every single one of these case studies involved dedicated ethnographic research, probably involving over 1,000 interviews with various users. This is not a meta-analysis, which is very fashionable at the moment. Meta-analyses are proliferating at the moment, but this is actually, each one of these case studies is based on primary ethnographic research, which gives us important and deep insights into each one of these 50 MPAs. And it's interesting because there's so many stories within these MPAs that we could spend all night talking about. But what I'm going to try and do today is just give you a focus on an overview of what these 50 case studies collectively show. Now, there's an Amish saying that a great deal of what we see depends on what we are looking for, or perhaps what we are expecting to see. So we need a way of looking at marine protected area governance that can see all the issues and approaches. Why is Pete putting this weird diagram up? Well, these lines are straight and horizontal, but we need a calibrated framing to see this. These orange circles are the same diameter, but again, our eyes are easily deceived. We need a calibrated framing in order to be able to see this. So we've developed the MPA governance analysis framework, which you could look at as a wide-angled, calibrated, empirical lens. We've used the same lens to look at each one of these 50 case studies. Each of these case studies has employed these same headings and way of deconstructing and analysing the governance of each one of those marine protected areas, which gives us a wonderful data set for comparing these 50 case studies in 24 countries around the world. Now, there's insufficient time today to describe all the elements of this framework, but suffice to say that it all pivots around effectiveness. Is the marine protected area achieving its conservation objectives? But it also dives deep into governance, into various cross-cutting issues. It's all the data that populates this framework is derived from ethnographic studies, particularly conversations with a research purpose again, also known as semi-structured interviews, document analyses and observations, somewhere between 15 and 25 interviews for each one of the 50 case studies. And we also have several cross-cutting issues. But again, I haven't got time to go into the detail of this empirical framework, but suffice to say it was consistently applied to all 50 of the case studies. To analyse the diversity of approaches that marine protected areas employ, we developed a typology of 36 incentives, perhaps more of a taxonomy than a typology. It's that biologist again in me fighting to get out. Incentives are defined as particular types of institution that are instrumentally designed in relation to a marine protected area to encourage actors, i.e. people involved, to behave in a manner that provides for certain strategic policy outcomes, particularly conservation objectives, to be achieved. There are so many different definitions of incentives. We kind of use Eleanor Ostrom's very broad definition of incentives, particularly focused, in this case, on achieving equitable and effective marine protected areas. Interviews, etc., indicated which incentives were used in setting up and managing particular marine protected areas, and which incentives were particularly in need of strengthening or introducing to improve effectiveness. And again, I don't have time to go into individual incentives, but anyone that's familiar with governance hopefully will see some familiar words in this taxonomy of incentives. This taxonomy itself emerged and evolved through the case study research, and so far has managed to capture all the governance processes in all 50 of the MPAs that we've studied around the world. So there's insufficient time today to discuss specific incentives and the various ways in which they are applied and combined, which is kind of where it gets really interesting. But this is a rich information source for both governance researchers and practitioners on the realities of marine protected area governance. We could even call this a menu that MPA managers or people interested in discussing marine protected area management could draw on. We've got case studies describing examples of how these incentives are applied in different ways in different contexts. But we haven't got time to dive into the detail of all these findings, but let's look at some broad findings. So the 50 MPAs in this analysis tend to use around 18 incentives, and particularly need around 6 incentives. And I hasten to add again that most of the information on which these used and needed incentives is based is derived from the ethnographic research. It's derived from talking to people and saying, what do you think, what needs to be done to make this marine protected area work better? What needs to be done to make it fairer and more equitable? So this is all ultimately derived from the findings of this research. We also found that they tend to particularly need an additional 6 incentives. So around 24 incentives seem to be commonly used or needed. 41% of the used incentives in this case study sample particularly needed strengthening, i.e. they were too weak. And that's quite a high figure. 41% of the incentives were considered to be too weak to promote effectiveness and equity. And that explains the relatively low effectiveness score for these MPAs. We've got an effectiveness scale between 0 and 5, which is very much focused on whether impacts of human activities are being reduced. If you reduce the human impacts, then the ecosystem will recover. So a score of 2 out of 5 on average across 50 case studies is quite startling, actually. It shows that on average we still have a long way to go before these MPAs actually are going to be effective. It, roughly speaking, equates to some impacts are partly addressed, but some impacts have not yet even begun to be addressed. The recent analysis also calculated average used rates and average needed rates for each incentive in each category. So, for example, a 0% used rate would indicate that no incentives in that category were used in a single case study, whereas a used rate of 100% would indicate that all the incentives in that category were used in all the case studies. And what this showed was that communication incentives were most frequently discussed as being used, whilst legal incentives are most frequently discussed as being needed. So we've got some very differing patterns here, depending on whether we focus on the incentives that are being used or the incentives that are discussed as being needed. And this makes sense because in order for people to cooperate or comply with MPA restrictions, they need to be aware that these restrictions exist, why they exist, the consequences of not following the regulations. Communication incentives also tend to be relatively inexpensive and easy to put in place. Hence, it follows that they'll be most frequently recognised as the most utilised category of incentives. Legal incentives, on the other hand, can be challenging to put in place. They require state capacity and support. They require political will. However, the need for them is widely appreciated. Hence, it follows that they will be the most frequently recognised as most needed. But we can disaggregate the used or needed rates. And the average used or needed rates, whilst communication incentives were most frequently cited, communication incentives here were most frequently cited as used or needed, there's a reasonably even spread of used or needed across all 5 categories of incentives. And again, without getting too involved in the data behind this, what this broadly speaking shows is it illustrates the importance of focusing on how a diversity of incentives from different categories can be functionally integrated to combine different governance approaches. Then we've got some very pretty, very colourful bar charts. These are the frequency with which incentives are cited as being used or needed, and then we disaggregate them into used or needed. And again, I'm not going to go into the detail of the individual incentives beyond saying that the 6 incentives most frequently cited as being used or needed are from across the 5 categories of incentives, which again, remember, is the 5 different approaches to governance. And this is our first illustration of the importance of diversity. That if we look at the incentives that are most frequently discussed as being used or needed, the top 6 are from representative of each of the 5 categories. the most frequently used or needed incentive being capacity for enforcement, and the least frequently used, just to pick one example out, is payments for ecosystem services. A great deal of theoretical interest in payments for ecosystem services, but not a single one of our case studies actually used them. And I think this is an example of a big gap between the debate that's raging in the literature and what's actually happening out there with marine protected areas. There's very rarely where they're only discussed as being needed in 2 of the 50 case studies. The 6 incentives most frequently cited as being used were again dominated by communication incentives, with raising awareness again being most frequently cited as being used. And the incentives most frequently cited as being needed are dominated again by legal incentives, along with 2 participative incentives. So in terms of needed, yes, we have 4 legal incentives, that's the top-down approach, but people also say we need bottom-up approaches. So again, it isn't an either-or situation. In another talk derived from this research, we could actually go down and drill down into the detail of how these incentives are functionally integrated and combined. But let's go back to the broad findings. We undertook a correlation analysis comparing the number of incentives that are used with effectiveness. And this shows that the more diverse the incentives, the more effective the marine protected area. That actually the more incentives that a marine protected area employs, the more effective it tends to be. We also did this scatter plot of the 50 case studies, and again, don't worry, I'm not going to delve into the detail of this. It's just a very quick visual overview of these are the most effective MPAs at the top, and these are the least effective MPAs at the bottom. And we can see as the colours change, as it gets darker, these are more and more incentives that are considered to be effectively used. They're strong enough to do their job. And what we can see even from this scatter diagram is that the more sufficiently strong incentives there are in place, the more effective the marine protected area tends to be. So from a practitioner's perspective, from a UN perspective, this is quite a key finding. But it isn't just a numbers game. You don't just throw incentives into the pot to reach some magic number. The incentives have to be the appropriate incentives for that context. And what this shows is its combinations of economic, legal, communication, knowledge and participatory incentives are shown to be employed in effective MPAs and mostly needed in less effective marine protected areas. We also conducted a genetic algorithm analysis, and I'm not even going to attempt to try and explain it this evening, but beyond saying that it indicates if any particular incentives, combinations of incentives, or contextual factors best predict effectiveness. And this shows that while some incentives are frequently identified as helping to promote effectiveness, there are no particular magic wand incentives or combinations of incentives that consistently guarantee this. There is no governance template for marine protected areas. Which of those 36 incentives apply to a marine protected area very much varies on a case-by-case basis. But there are some trends and learnings that we can gain from this sort of analysis. So to reach some co-evolutionary conclusions, going way back to Ecology 101 here, what key attribute confers stability and thereby resilience in ecosystems? Ecologists used to argue like hell about this until the late 1990s, when this paper was published in Nature in 1998 by Hollis. The answer is diversity. It's a diversity of species from different functional groups, interacting with each other to promote the resilience of the ecosystem. What key attribute, tricky one this, confers stability in governance systems? Guess what? It's diversity. But now it's a diversity of interacting incentives, not from different functional groups, but from incentive groups. But the analogy maps across. And I think this is a theme that's consistently run through my research. I'm still fascinated by ecology. I always have to understand the ecology of the marine protected areas that we're studying. But I kind of look at the governance systems through a similar lens, focusing on how these synecological functional interactions between species and between the governance system that aims to protect that marine ecosystem. But in the same way as you must have the right species assemblage for particular ecosystems, it is important to have the right incentives for a particular MPA governance context. So again, we're not trying to prescribe some template for marine protected area governance, more a menu of governance approaches that can be drawn on and case studies illustrating how these incentives have been combined in different contexts. So now looking at marine protected areas as co-evolutionary social ecological systems with reciprocal feedback. What is he going on about? Well, let's look at marine protected areas as both social systems and ecosystems. And in this case, we have a low diversity of weakly interacting incentives, high human impacts, a degraded marine ecosystem from which we're getting a very slow flow of ecosystem services like food provision, coastal defence, marine tourism. The average effectiveness score of 2 indicates, unfortunately, that many MPAs are actually in this rather depleted state. But there is hope. If we can improve the governance framework for a marine protected area, remember, in order to achieve that 30% by 2030 target, this is what we've got to do to all the marine protected areas around the world. We've got to strengthen the governance framework, to reduce the impacts of human uses, and start to restore the marine ecosystem. But there's a problem here. When you strengthen the governance framework to reduce the impacts of human activities, it takes the ecosystem 3 to 5 years, maybe as much as 35 years, to respond. So actually bridging that gap between putting the management restrictions in place and the ecosystem recovery and delivering a higher flow of ecosystem services is again a particular challenge for governance, and we have a whole suite of incentives that again we could have another talk about, which can help you bridge that gap. But ultimately this is where we want to go, towards that 30% by 2030 target. With time, the ecosystem will recover if impacts remain reduced, and feedback will occur through enhanced flows of ecosystem services, making both the ecosystem and the social system more resilient, hence this idea of co-evolutionary governance for social ecological resilience. So it's through these MPAs of co-evolutionary social ecological systems with reciprocal feedback mechanisms, this is how we illustrate this concept of co-evolutionary governance and how it applies to marine protected areas. And grounding this concept, we have some examples of how resilience can be built through more effective governance. So we had Chumber Island Coral Park in Zanzibar and Isla Natividad Marine Protected Area, for example, in Mexico, where we can actually follow this cause-effect steps through towards restoring the system, making the ecosystem more resilient, and thereby also making the social system more resilient. But unfortunately, there are limits to resilience. And these are 2 slides that I woke up at 5 o'clock this morning and thought, you've got to talk about reality. And sometimes that's less than encouraging news. So the limits to resilience case study is the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. Now, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is interesting because it is huge. If we laid the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park across Europe, it would stretch from Dublin to Mallorca. I prefer Aberdeen to Lisbon myself, but whichever span you wish to choose. But suffice to say that by European standards, this is a huge marine protected area, and actually quite iconic in marine protected area anorak circles that I hang around in a great deal. And scale is a recurring theme in geography, and the Great Barrier Reef, as I say, really is very large. But we also have to think about the scale of impacts. And the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is inspiring in that it shows that increasing protection from local impacts, fishing, through they rezoned the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park and increased the area of no-take zones from 4.7% to 33.6% of the total Great Barrier Reef Marine Park area. A very bold step, and the Great Barrier Reef was considered something of an icon of hope in this respect because it was held up as a template of how we can combine top-down and bottom-up approaches towards more effective MPAs. And subsequent research found that no-take zones within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park are more resilient to crown of thorns starfish outbreaks and recover sooner than crown of thorns starfish outbreaks. And again, we could have another lecture on those, but we have to quickly move on. But less inspiring, perhaps almost depressing, which is the word that occurred to me this morning at 5 o'clock, or potentially depressing, the Great Barrier Reef is becoming increasingly evident that it is gravely threatened by coral bleaching due to the global scale impacts of climate change, from which no degree of local scale protection can confer resilience. So there are limits to the resilience that this effective governance can achieve. And I was flabbergasted one morning on one of my many, many commutes from Brighton up to London, sat on a train in southeast England, and there was a poster on the train saying, if you want to save the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, we've got to get serious about climate change. And I think that's one, if there's only one take-home message from this lecture, and remember this when it comes up to election time, if we want to have coral reefs beyond 2050, 2060, no amount of marine protected areas and effective governance is going to save them. We have got to address climate change. And it's crucial that the Great Barrier Reef, like other marine and terrestrial ecosystems threatened by climate change, must become an inspiration for the lifestyle and structural changes that are needed to urgently address climate change. Sylvia Earle refers to marine protected areas as hope spots. They give us hope for the future. But as far as coral reefs are concerned, there is no hope unless we address climate change. That's the depressing bit out of the way, I'm afraid. Back to the theory again. It isn't just about increasing the number and diversity of the incentives. It's more about which incentives are appropriate to that marine protected area. So it's also important to consider how incentives from different categories interact with and support each other. I've mentioned this word synecology a few times. Synecology is the branch of ecology that looks how different species from different functional groups interact with each other, whereas autoecology is focused on the ecology of individual species. So we kind of take a synecology approach to studying governance, not just looking at the role of individual incentives, very focused on how incentives are functionally integrated with each other in the same way as ecologists are fascinated by functional integration between species. And if we take this view, the distinction between top-down, bottom-up and market governance approaches becomes blurred, if not irrelevant, because you need to combine governance incentives based on all three approaches. So the distinction between top-down and bottom-up and market approaches really is a false one. We need to start focusing on how they can be integrated and combined. So the conclusion is here, worry not. The conclusion is here. In the face of strong driving forces, the combined use of a diversity of functionally integrated incentives makes MPA governance frameworks more resilient. Resilience in MPA governance frameworks is thereby woven by complex webs connecting incentives from all 5 categories. But without strong legal incentives to reinforce the MPA governance framework, it will not be resilient. And I guess this research, to a degree, is kind of a challenge to neo-institutionalists, as we call them, Eleanor Ostrom and many other people who are very focused on participative development. Bottom-up approaches are really important, but so are top-down approaches and so are market approaches. It's only when you have that functional combination of all 3 governance approaches, ultimately, that you will have an effective MPA. And what we have here is the potential for an upward spiral of cooperation, reduced impacts, enhanced flows of ecosystem services, people realising that they're benefiting from protection and more willing to cooperate and agree to further restrictions on use. And again, we're seeing this in some marine protected areas. We don't want to impose restrictions on people. We want people to witness the benefits of protection. And again, we've got many examples from the case studies that illustrate how you can take this combined social, ecological systems approach. Ultimately aiming towards the resilience both of the ecosystem and of the social system. So accepting that all functional groups of species are important, the question of which category of incentives is most important or which incentive itself is most important becomes irrelevant, as they're all important in the same way as all functional groups of species are important in ecosystems. Having said that, though, apex predators have got very strong regulatory roles, so maybe our legal incentives are a bit like apex predators. They've got very strong regulatory roles. But you can't make an ecosystem out of apex predators, nor can you make a governance system out of legal incentives. Again, it's all about diversity combining governance approaches. So where this work, this research not only has very important, in my opinion, academic implications, because it is quite a bold challenge to a lot of contemporary thinking on natural resource governance, but it's also been picked up, amongst others, by UN Environment Programme, who developed this guidance for MPA managers around the world based on 34 of these case studies, as well as the many acronyms that Jan kindly listed at the beginning. As all that sort of government advice and policy advice has been derived from this research on the co-evolutionary governance of marine protected areas. So to the conclusion. This leads us to the conclusion reached in the final sentence of the book that I put up but didn't mention at the beginning. You'll notice that. The UNEP guidance, the Jones and Long paper, and no doubt the forthcoming paper analysing 50 case studies. Diversity is the key to resilience, both of species in ecosystems and incentives in governance systems. And I think that is a conclusion of which Yoda would approve. Thank you very much. Thank you.